He was one of the 5 Istari. He was sent to Middle-earth for good reasons. He failed his task. But what did Saruman really do during his time on Middle-earth? Let's find that out today. Hello and welcome to The Broken Sword. Today we are looking at the full story of Saruman the Wizard.
Build me an army worthy of Mordor.
As one of the 5 Istari, Saruman is an ancient and powerful being, brought to life by the late, great Christopher Lee in the popular film trilogy by Peter Jackson. The character of Saruman has remained, of all times, an interest. When did he go wrong though? What was his original purpose? How powerful was he? Today we are going to try and answer each of those questions and look at the full story of Saruman the White, or Saruman of many colours. We will go through looking at a number of accounts which illustrate the character of Saruman long before he was known by such a name. When the series was first published, the criticism of the tale being one of purely good versus purely evil was put forth, something we still see today. In response to this very idea though, Tolkien responded. Not that I have made even this issue quite so simple. There are Saruman, and Denethor, and Boromir, and there are treacheries and strife even among the orcs. This is one of the many times Tolkien spoke of his wizards in letters, to attempt to clarify some of their functions or powers. For example, also in letter 156 he explained, of Gandalf, I would venture to say that he was an incarnate angel, strictly an angelos, that is, with the other Istari, wizards, those who know, an emissary from the Lords of the West sent to Middle-earth as the great crisis of Sauron loomed on the horizon. By incarnate, I mean they were embodied in physical bodies capable of pain and weariness, and of afflicting the spirit with physical fear and of being killed. Though supported by the angelic spirit, they might endure long, and only show slowly the wearing of care and labour. During the Second Age, Saruman was living as a Maya of Aule in a man. We have no word on what his specific interests were, as Tolkien gives us no information. We can only imagine what he would do. Perhaps he was more focused on his works and enjoyed life as a privileged Maya, though it is possible that, being of the same race of Sauron, he would have been curious about what this Lord of the Rings was doing as the Noldor and Sindar fled Middle-earth and began to arrive in Toloressia and Aman. When Sauron went to Numenor, we can only guess that, with the situation becoming an increasingly worrisome one for all of Valinor and Aldemar. We can suppose that had Saruman played an active role, it might have been mentioned, as the Valar were there as Eru Ilúvatar himself intervened. Afterwards is when we get more direct information on Saruman and his doings after Sauron began to rise again at the ending of the first millennium of the Third Age. At this point, the Valar decided they needed to help the free peoples of Middle-earth by way of sending emissaries, in the matter of an angelic being representative of the Valar, the powers of the world. As Tolkien wrote of Gandalf being a messenger, we must consider that he intended the same for Saruman originally. But as we know from the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, Saruman began looking for the One Ring in the year 2851 of the Third Age, and we know that he did so to benefit himself. In the last book of the Silmarillion of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, the wizards are described as such. But afterwards, it was said among elves that they were messengers sent by the Lords of the West to contest the power of Sauron, if he should arise again, and to move elves and men and all living things of good will to valiant deeds. In the likeness of men they appeared, old but vigorous, and they changed little with the years, and aged but slowly, though great cares lay on them, great wisdom they had, and many powers of mind and hand. Long they journeyed far and wide among elves and men, and held converse also with beasts and with birds, and the peoples of Middle-earth gave to them many names, for their true names they did not reveal. Chief among them were those whom the elves called Mithrandir and Curanir, but men in the north named Gandalf and Saruman. Of these, Curanir was the eldest and came first, and after him came Mithrandir and Radagast, the others of the Istari who went into the east of Middle-earth and do not come into these tales. We learn more of the Istari from the Unfinished Tales of Numenor and Middle-earth Part 4, Chapter 2, The Istari. It is there we read that the word wizard is just a translation from the Quenya word Istar and the Sindarin Ithron, each functioning as a member of an order, claiming to possess and exhibiting eminent knowledge of the history and nature of the world. Tolkien writes, "The translation, though suitable in its relation to wise and other ancient words of knowing, similar to that of Istar in Quenya, is not perhaps happy, since the Heron Istarion or Order of Wizards was quite distinct from the wizards and magicians of later legend. They belonged solely to the Third Age and then departed, and none save maybe Elrond, Círdan and Galadriel discovered of what they were or whence they came. At an unknown time between the Second and early Third Age, the Valar called a council to decide what is to be done about the growing threat of Sauron. The Valar, being the powers of the world, have decided to actively aid in the fight against Sauron, but know that they cannot do so using force, as the amount of damage caused the last time the Valar intervened had extreme consequences for Arda, Singing Beleriand and all to the west beneath the waves. Their alternative to force was to send Maiar into Middle-earth in physical bodies. In the Unfinished Tales, we learn that Gandalf, known then as the spirit Olorin, is humbled and fearful of Sauron, whereas Carumo, Saruman's name at the time, was ready to take Sauron on and head the Order from the beginning. He is a natural leader, and Gandalf refers to him in such a way in the Fellowship of the Ring. Emissaries they were from the Lords of the West, the Valar, who still took counsel for the governance of Middle-earth, and when the shadow of Sauron began to first stir again, took this means of resisting him. For with the consent of Eru they sent members of their own high order, but clad in bodies as of men, real and not feigned, but subject to the fears and pains and weariness of earth, able to hunger and thirst and to be slain, though because of their noble spirits they did not die, and aged only by the cares and labours of many long years. And this the Valar did, desiring to amend the errors of old, especially that they had attempted to guard and seclude the Eldar by their own might and glory fully revealed, whereas now their emissaries were forbidden to reveal themselves in forms of majesty, or to seek to rule the wills of men or elves by open display of power, but coming in shapes weak and humble, were bidden to advise and persuade men and elves to good, and to seek to unite in love and understanding all those whom Sauron, should he come again, would endeavour to dominate and corrupt. Of this order the number is unknown, but of those that came to the north of Middle-earth, where there was most hope, because of the remnant of the Dunedain and of the Eldar that abode there, the chiefs were 5. The first to come was one of noble mind and bearing, with raven hair and a fair voice, and he was clad in white. Great skill he had in works of hand, and he was regarded by well nigh all, even the Eldar, as the head of the order. Others there were also, 2 clad in sea blue and 1 of earthen brown, and the last one who seemed the least, less tall than the others, and in looks more aged, grey-haired and grey-clad and leaning on a staff. But Círdan, from their first meeting at the Grey Havens, divided in him the greatest spirit and the wisest, and he welcomed him with reverence, and he gave to his keeping the 3rd ring, Narya the Red. For, he said, great labours and perils lie before you, and lest your task prove too great and wearisome, take this ring for your aid and comfort. It was entrusted to me only to keep secret, and here upon the west shores it is idle, but I deem that in days ere long to come it should be in nobler hands than mine, that may wield it for the kindling of all hearts to courage. And the grey messenger took the ring, and kept it ever secret, yet the white messenger, who was skilled to uncover all secrets, after a time became aware of this gift, and begrudged it, and it was the beginning of the hidden ill will that he bore to the Grey, which afterwards became manifest. Now the White Messenger in later days became known among elves as Curanir, the man of craft, in the tongues of northern men, Saruman, but that was after he returned from his many journeys and came into the realm of Gondor and there abode. This is actually an interesting point that I'd like to now bring up and really ask a question to you all, which I would love it if you left me a comment of, and that is, do you think that potentially in some ways it was Círdan's fault Saruman turned to evil? Do you think giving the Ring Narya to him is what set Saruman on his slippery slope to evil? Let me know in the comments below, either with a comment of, it was Círdan's fault, or it was not Círdan's fault. I'd just be curious to see what you all think of this. But anyway, let's now carry on to the wanderings of Saruman. Little is known of Saruman's actions in the first 1,500 years that he dwelt in Middle-earth. All we have comes from the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, and it only tells us that he journeyed often to the east. This might be a hint that his continued search for power, or it could be a hint at his early dealings with the famously lost Blue Wizards. He journeyed often to and from the east, but after 1,500 years of wandering, Saruman returned to the west. It is possible that he sought out the One Ring for himself at this time, as we know that he did come close. After the coronation of King Elessar, he and Gimli went into Orthanc and found the very necklace that once hung about Isildur's neck, which is hard to explain without Saruman's active pursuit and his dragging of Isildur's body out of the waters where he was felled at the Fields of Gladden. His return to the east corresponds with the growing power of Sauron at Dol Guldur. Is this a coincidence? I think not. It is also possible that he was already working to undermine the work of Gandalf in his capacity as emissary of the Valar, sent to inspire hope and fortify the hearts of men against the coming of Sauron. Saruman did not see Sauron as a foe to be taken on, but as a rival to be supplanted. First of all, it is important to note that Saruman did not build Orthanc, the tower, or Isengard, the surrounding fortress and barrier walls. This great fortress was built by the Númenóreans between 3320 and 3430 of the Second Age, when the Last Alliance was created. The keys to the Tower of Orthanc were given over to Saruman by Beren, the Steward of Gondor in 2759 of the Third Age. At Isengard, Saruman would find one of the lost Seeing Stones and take possession of the Palantir, keeping it secret for many years. It was at the crowning of Freylaf that Saruman appeared, bringing gifts and speaking great praise of the valour of the Rohirrim. All thought him a welcome guest. Soon after, he took up his abode in Isengard. For this, Beren, Steward of Gondor, gave him leave, for Gondor still claimed Isengard as a fortress of its realm, and not part of Rohan. Beren also gave Saruman's keeping the keys of Orthanc. That tower no enemy had been able to harm or to enter. In this way, Saruman began to behave as a lord of men, for at first he held Isengard as a lieutenant of the steward and warden of the tower. But Freylaf was as glad as Beren to have this so, and to know that Isengard was in the hands of a strong friend. A friend he long seemed, and maybe in the beginning he was one in truth. Though afterwards there was little doubt in men's minds that Saruman went to Isengard in hope to find the stone still there, and with the purpose of building up a power of his own. Certainly after the last White Council in 2953, his designs towards Rohan, though he hid it, were evil. He then took Isengard for his own and began to make it a place of guarded strength and fear, as though to rival Barad-dûr. His friends and servants he drew then from all who hated Gondor and Rohan, whether men or other creatures more evil. And we are also told along with this, Thorongil often warned Ecthelion not to put trust in Saruman the White in Isengard, but to welcome rather Gandalf the Grey. But there was little love between Denethor and Gandalf, and after the days of Ecthelion there was less welcome for the Grey Pilgrim in Minas Tirith. Therefore later, when all was made clear, many believed that Denethor, who was subtle in mind and looked further and deeper than other men of his day, had discovered who this stranger Thorongil in truth was, and suspected that he and Mithrandir designed to supplant him. Thorongil, of course, was a name Aragorn often took in his youth when adventuring in the lands of Rohan and Gondor. It is easy to see why, in this instance, he would be less trusting of such a suggestion despite its actual wisdom. In The Lord of the Rings, the history of the ring is revealed partially in the chapter of the Shadow of the Past, and further again then in the Council of Elrond within Rivendell. When Saruman is first mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, it is in this chapter. "Who is he?" asked Frodo. "I have never heard of him before." "Maybe not," answered Gandalf. "Hobbits are, or were, no concern of his. Yet he is great amongst the wise. He is the chief of my order and head of the council. His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill any meddling. The lore of the Elven rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making. But when the rings were debated in the council, all that he would reveal to us of his ring lore told against my fears, so my doubts slept, but uneasily. Still I watched and I waited. And all seemed well with Bilbo, and the years passed. Yes, they passed, and they seemed not to touch him. He showed no signs of age. The shadow fell on me again, but I said to myself, after all, he comes of a long-lived family on his mother's side. There is time yet, wait. And I waited, until that night when he left this house. He said and did things then that filled me with a fear that no words of Saruman could allay. I knew at last that something dark and deadly was at work, and I have spent most of the years since then in finding out the truth of it. Much of the backstory given at the beginning of the films is given here, in the Council of Elrond, and by further explanation, Gandalf explains how Gollum travelled to Mordor and how Bilbo and the Shire's location were given up to the enemy. He further explains his encounter with Saruman, and how this meeting was used by Saruman to convince Gandalf to join him and Sauron. Gandalf refuses and is imprisoned, only to later escape with the help of the Eagles. It is in Rivendell that Frodo learns the truth of Strider, the One Ring, and the importance of his mission that, to that point, he had not fully comprehended. Speaking at the council, we learn what Saruman said. "A new power is rising. Against it the old allies and policies will not avail us at all. There is no hope left in elves or dying Númenor. This then is one choice before you, before us. We may join with that power. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. Its victory is at hand, and there will be rich reward for those that aided it." If we then proceed to the Two Towers, when Saruman's fighting Uruk-hai and Sauron's orcs get into a fight, Merry and Pippin then flee into a forest, climb atop a hill and look for a better view. It is then when they meet Treebeard the Ent. Treebeard wants news of Gandalf and reveals that he dislikes Saruman's recent activities. Treebeard tells them that though Saruman was once wise and learned, he turned away from the natural world and towards machines, crossbreeding orcs and men to create the Uruk-hai. Treebeard himself calls the Entmoot to deliberate what options they have to deal with Saruman, and after some deliberation, the Ents are off to war. From Orthanc, Saruman summons fire from the ground to burn the Ents alive, but they divert the River Isen and drown out the flame, trapping Saruman in the Tower of Orthanc that was once his strongpoint. Saruman appears in a rainbow-coloured robe and attempts to enchant the company, with Merry and Pippin now joined by Gandalf and Theoden, who come to confront Saruman. They are warned against the power of Saruman's speech, as he has a magical ability with words. Saruman refuses to repent when given the chance, and Gandalf breaks his staff, so he cannot use his weapon any longer. After he removes his white robe and dons the robe of many colours, he forges his own rings of power. He refers to himself as Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ring Maker, and Saruman of Many Colours. In the film version, Saruman is omitted entirely from the theatrical cut of The Return of the King, but we do get to see him in the extended edition, a point to which Sir Christopher Lee very much was not happy himself. At the beginning of the film, he is holed up in Isengard, surrounded and trapped by the Ents and betrayed unto his death by Grima Wormtongue. This is not how his ending comes upon him in the books. After his armies are defeated at the Hornburg, or at Helm's Deep for you in Peter Jackson's films, the Ents are unable to actually do damage to the structure of Orthanc, built long ago by the might and majesty of the Númenóreans. But Treebeard pities him, and so he lets him leave. This is where one of the most controversial cuts from the films does take place, the removal of the Scouring of the Shire, wherein Saruman, Vati Bolga, and a group of thugs have done much the same to the Shire as they had done to the lands of Isengard, polluting its rivers and filling its skies with smoke. They discover that Saruman has hidden himself under the name Sharky, overseeing the destruction of the Shire and its marring. Though his death is different in the book, his death comes all the same. In his last exchange with Wormtongue, Saruman accuses him of murder, which was something Saruman had actually forced Wormtongue into. This proves to be the breaking point for the despicable Wormtongue. He cuts Saruman's throat before he is taken down by a volley of hobbit archers. The description of his death is particularly gruesome. To the dismay of those that stood by, about the body of Saruman a grey mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height like smoke from a fire, as a pale shrouded figure it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking to the west, but out of the west came a cold wind, and it bent away, and with a sigh dissolved into nothing. Frodo looked down at the body with pity and horror, for as he looked it seemed that long years of death were suddenly revealed in it, and it shrank, and the shriveled face became rags of skin upon a hideous skull. Lifting up the skirt of the dirty cloak that sprawled beside it, he covered it over, and turned away. So there we have it, the end of the once potentially great wizard of Saruman. Saruman was a long-lived and powerful being. With all his power and wisdom, he was still liable to the follies of envy, pride, and lust. Throughout the story of Saruman, over and over, we see his pride and hubris, his willingness to use force, and his rather loose moral compass. The hints we have of his eventual fate are many, but there is much to say about him as a literary creation. One of the criticisms of Tolkien in modern times is that his characters are either purely evil or purely good, while Saruman, though fully turned evil at his ending, was a being with a conflicted soul, gifted great power but restrained in its usage, glimpsing Sauron's strength and being unable to contest it. This was something his pride would not allow, and like a disease, the slow rot came over his soul and drove him into his ruin. It is a mighty shame that an angelic being like that once of Curinia, living life long before any of us could comprehend, and really proving he failed his mission. The once great Maya of Aule the Smith, the one named Karumo. This angelic being was sent by the Valar as one of the 5 Istari to help fight against the darkness of Sauron around the year 1000 of the Third Age. But it is safe to say he really did not stick to his mission and even come close to completing his given task. He believed that he needed to impose order into Middle-earth through whatever means necessary, whether that be through the gaining of power or even betraying the mission that the Valar sent him there to complete. But we will come back to this in a bit, as his idea of order does play an important role in kind of figuring out how this question may be answered. A lot of his decision making came from envy and desire to have Sauron's power, especially for the possession of the One Ring. So, after initially arriving in Middle-earth, Saruman did not make an immediate home, and instead he travelled for a short time into the east, towards the lands where the elves first appeared all that time before, and then before later making his home in Isengard. This is believed to be the case because he read about the location of the Palantir being here from his time dissecting the archives within Minas Tirith. More time would pass, and Saruman would continue to hunt for any hints of the whereabouts of the One Ring, and only once he understands that Sauron did in fact have more knowledge of its location would he then consent later to an attack on Dol Guldur in 2941 of the Third Age, as at this point he was the head of the White Council. Saruman's pride and arrogance would continue to swell, along with his jealousy towards Gandalf, and this mixed into a dangerous concoction, for this led him to opening communication and becoming dominated by Sauron, and this was all through the use of the Palantir. So, in a way, he became a servant of his will, or at least appears to be. So, his intentions here were one of two things: to seize the One Ring for himself, or, if he could not, to stand as an ally to the victorious Sauron. This is where his attention turns to Rohan. He influences and buys out the allegiance of Grima Wormtongue, chief advisor to King Theoden, and through him influences poor counsel to an already weakening king. Then, as we know from The Lord of the Rings, he captures Gandalf, who escapes, and finally reveals his true intentions to the forces of good. The Witch King would then pay Saruman a visit just days after Gandalf's escape, where Saruman lies to him about having any knowledge of this so-called place called the Shire. However, this would not end well, as you may expect, as in September of 3018, the Nazgul would be on their hunt, and would capture one of the wizard's Shire spies, who revealed to them that Saruman was planning another betrayal, a traitor to his quest, a traitor to the Free Peoples, a traitor to the Dark Lord. There was only one hope for him now: finding the One Ring and keeping it for himself. He still tried to deceive Sauron by promising to kill Theodred, King Theoden's son, and with this he also sent out several parties of his fighting Uruk-hai with the goal of finding the Fellowship. One of these groups is the one that would ambush the Fellowship at Amon Hen, where they would capture Merry and Pippin and kill Boromir of Gondor. Then we know from here he would lay siege to Helm's Deep, and while this was going on, he attacked in his home by the Ents of Fangorn with Merry and Pippin. Both battles would not go his way. He would lose quite dramatically, but what if he hadn't? What was his next move if he had won and survived both of these assaults? Well, quickly, before we jump into this, I would like to say to you all, do you want to see a full story of Saruman video like I have done with the likes of Gandalf and Malkor in the past? If you do, then please just leave me a comment of Saruman of many colours, and I will get working on that for you. But anyway, after that quick pause, let's get back to the video. Now we have potentially a couple of options, and these boil down to: does Saruman find the One Ring, or does he not? Let us imagine things went a little bit differently here. Saruman's fighting Uruk-hai managed to topple Helm's Deep quickly before Gandalf and Erkenbrand could arrive as the reinforcements. All our heroes would be slain. There would be no more Aragorn, no more Legolas, no more Gimli, no more Theoden, and no more Eomer either. Isengard's army manages to fortify themselves inside of Helm's Deep, so when the cavalry charge arrives and Gandalf leads from the front, he is far less effective, and these Uruk-hai could come out victorious here too. Maybe half their army even pull back a bit, they used a pincer movement and trapped the reinforcements, wiping them out. So what does this mean? Well, what it does mean is Saruman has now managed to take out nearly all of the biggest threats in one swift blow. At this point, he could be considered a master at war from his own tower within Orthanc. But we need to imagine that not just this battle is different, but the one at Isengard too. Perhaps this time Saruman was wiser to the powerful beings he had been upsetting. He was prepared for the potential march of the Ents, so he set himself up with several fire-based defences on the outskirts and throughout his base. The Ents do not manage to trap him. They all perish, which in this scenario includes Merry and Pippin too, and Saruman now comes out victorious on two fronts. And now this is where we will make a split in our two potential what-ifs, if you will. For our first possibility, Saruman is now full of confidence, having wiped out not only the returning Gandalf the White, but also the heir of Elendil and the King of Rohan. But now they are gone, what is his purpose? Well, the same as it always is with Saruman: to create order and enforce it. Saruman would now know that Gondor was weakened, so Sauron would launch a full-scale assault on that front. And now that there was no Rohirrim to come in support, their chances of survival are drastically reduced. And not just that, but there was now also no Grey Company to follow Aragorn there either, meaning basically all reinforcements once the battle starts no longer exist. Without the One Ring, Saruman would not be brave enough to march to Mordor and challenge Sauron yet. So first things first, he would have sent his armies to destroy any small forms of resistance within Rohan and burnt everything down. Next stop, build his army. He knew Sauron would not trust him after his betrayal, and he had already been uncovered, so he had to get ready to be attacked. But at the same time, keep searching for the One Ring, for that was his biggest hope of victory. Now he had two options. Attack Sauron while he attacked Minas Tirith to hope that he could strike a surprise on an already distracted army, or option 2, hold up inside Isengard and just hope he can make an impenetrable defense. Now personally, I believe he would choose the latter. He would want to stay safe, while still secretly hunting for the ring. But I do not think this would work well. Without reinforcements, Gondor would fall. There would be no reunited kingdom of the race of men, and hope would fail. And once they were dealt with, Sauron's eye would turn either to Isengard or to the elves. And in whichever order he chooses to go at these, when the time came to it, I cannot see a way that Sauron would not be victorious. He could send orcs, trolls, the Nazgul, the men of Harad with their Mumakil, and the Easterlings too. Saruman would have to find one hell of a way of producing Uruk-hai to be able to withstand this. Even if it is said that a single Uruk-hai is as good as multiple orcs, the rate of production is just never going to happen. So in the end, if this is how the events ran, then the end for Saruman would be the same. But instead of being let escape by the Ents and eventually killed by Grima in the Shire, Sauron would either make sure he is killed in battle or left to rot, chained up, with no hope of escape, whatever the powers of his voice may have once been. Now, this is where we look at our other possibility, so we'll go back to that split, and this differs due to the march of the Ents. Now imagine here, instead of killing every single one of them, Saruman actually captures the two hobbits, Merry and Pippin, alive from this assault, and through his powers he learns of Frodo and Sam. He knows that he has killed everyone else from their fellowship at Amon Hen and Helm's Deep, so the other two hobbits must have gone off on their own around the time of the attack on Amon Hen. So Saruman sends as many scouts as he can to hunt them down, including the crows. These crows will then find the location of Frodo and Sam, and they cannot escape as their enemies close in. So now, Saruman has the One Ring that he has greatly desired for such a long time. But what does this mean? What is Saruman capable of now that he has this almighty weapon? Again, we have a couple of options. The one I believe is more likely is that he probably cannot do as much as he would have hoped. After all, if Saruman had taken and claimed the ring for his own, Sauron would have most likely been made aware of this immediately. Then, what happens next comes down to the way Sauron would react. Would he wish to reclaim the One Ring as soon as possible, or would he bide his time? It is most likely he would want to go quickly. He has been hunting for this ring to make him all powerful again for so long. Now that he knows of his exact location, this is the last thing that he needs. To go with that too, Saruman would not be able to master this ring overnight, and it would take time even for a master in ring craft and magic as Saruman was. If Sauron could get back there before he can risk Saruman gaining mastery over it, then it massively tips the scales in his own favour. If he waited too long and somehow Saruman does completely gain mastery over it, then he's risking being overpowered by the wizard himself. So he would most likely not take any risks of sending anyone else, and at this point just go himself. We must remember, when he thought Aragorn had the ring when he looked into the Palantir, Sauron reacted with a very quick offensive strike, meaning that a confrontation between Saruman and Sauron is basically inevitable at this point. When the two come to it though, it would not be a closely fought battle. Gandalf was not believed to have the direct strength to take down Sauron, but Gandalf was able to cast out Saruman. It seems as though Sauron would have more easily had the upper hand in such a contest, especially if Saruman had not mastered the One Ring yet either. Would there have been a full-scale army assault? Maybe, It is likely he would bring that massive army with him to strike fear into Saruman and hopefully just get him to hand over the One Ring. But if he did have the ring, then he would likely also become blind with his potential power. I think in the end, it could just come down to a one-on-one contest within Orthanc, of which I can only see one real outcome. Sauron wins again. Now there was another potential option, and that would involve if Saruman could hide the fact that he had the One Ring from Sauron. If he did so, and as quickly as he could before making Sauron aware, he would build up an empire of mighty warriors, all bred for the single purpose of war and victory over Sauron. But I don't think this would have changed much by the very end. We must remember that in the Council of Elrond, it was said that while the ring still existed, the forces of good could have no real hope of truly defeating Sauron. So even if Saruman defeated his army, he would most likely just go away in a far-off land and rebuild his strength just like he did after the War of the Last Alliance. You've really got to remember, Sauron has existed since the beginning of time. If he has to wait another 1,000 years or so to rebuild and go again, does that really mean a lot to him? Probably not. At the end of the day, I think no matter what Saruman did, Sauron would just be too much of a powerful opponent to be able to overcome. So that's what I believe basically Saruman's plans were if he had defeated Rohan. I think that in terms of Saruman himself, his fate would have gone the same. He would have simply wanted to grow his power and enforce order over all of Middle-earth, but he would have wanted to do this alone. Sitting on a throne alongside Sauron would not have been an option. He would have wanted to do it by himself. He had become too greedy and self-confident in his time to really consider sharing anything. No matter whatever those plans may have been, I think in terms of Saruman himself, his fate would have been the same. As I said, he grew too greedy, and in the end, this would be his downfall. Whether that was going to be at the hands of Grima, of Sauron, or of someone else entirely, he was simply destined to live the rest of his existence as some dust in the wind. When we do consider the battle between Sauron and Saruman though, we do need to remember that they were both in origin Maya of Aule. This means that they may be expected to have some knowledge of each other, and therefore that they would have some idea of each other's strengths and weaknesses. If that is the case, then that is information that could potentially use to really change potential events. I mean, if he really believed he could win, then Saruman must surely have had an awareness of something to do with Sauron to think that this was possible. Or again, perhaps simply, it was just his lust for power has just blinded him that much, he just doesn't really have a clue. It could be quite hard to say. Saruman is not supposed to remember anything of his time before he came to Middle-earth, so it might be a one-sided thing. Saruman might potentially know of Karumo and figure out that this is Saruman, and Saruman might have no idea at all. It is quite funny how so much of these what if videos comes down to a simple what if. So, who knows?
We must join with him, Gandalf. We must join with Sauron.
Gandalf versus Saruman. The treason of Isengard. The wizard turned many colours. Saruman came out victorious, but did not take Gandalf's life. Why was this? Did he have a plan? Hello and welcome to The Broken Sword, your YouTube home for The Lord of the Rings and all things J.R.R. Tolkien. In today's video, we look at the thought process behind Saruman's decisions. One of the most important confrontations to take place within The Lord of the Rings is that of Saruman the White and Gandalf the Grey. This confrontation between old friends shows us how the two Istari have gone down entirely different paths and have arrived at different choices. Saruman had decided by the beginning of the time of the Fellowship of the Ring that it was pointless to resist Sauron and decided to try to convince Gandalf to likewise betray the Free Peoples of Middle-earth, to betray their mission. Gandalf refused, of course, and so Saruman captured Gandalf and imprisoned him on top of the Orthanc Tower at Isengard. Later though, with the help of his friend Radagast and the great eagle Gwaihir, he would manage to escape and become one of the fiercest opponents of the fallen wizard. But this brings me to today's question for this video, and also one for all of you from me. Firstly, would you like to see a book versus movie comparison for the Treason of Isengard, and see where things may have been altered? If you would, then please drop a like on the video, it massively helps us out. Give it a share, it really does help the channel, and leave us a comment below of the the treason of Isengard to really show you on that video, and I will get it added on the list of things to get done. But now, for the real question for today, why did Saruman not kill Gandalf when he refused to join him? Let's get into it.
When did Saruman the Wise abandon reason for madness?
Saruman lays all his cards on the table, and once revealed, Gandalf becomes one of the main threats to Saruman and his plans going forward. This really begs the question of how the Fellowship would have fared had they set out on their adventure without the guidance of Gandalf. Would they have gone through Moria at all, for example? If you recall, Aragorn was doubly opposed to going through the mines, and he is not easily scared away from anything. If not for Gandalf overruling him, as it were, we might have seen the continued attempt to cross the Pass of Caradhras. Not only that, the Fellowship would be without their true leader, and should they have continued on to Rohan, how sure are we that the Fellowship, as it was comprised, could have restored Theoden King to health and Meduseld? It is possible that Treebeard would never have embarked on the path of open confrontation with Isengard. And the further possibility is that the armies of Rohan would not be able to muster in time to help Gondor at the most critical moment during the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. The first answer might be hidden when Gandalf explains his absence to Frodo, why he did not meet him in Bree and why he was not there during their hard drive to Rivendell. We get a recollection of the dialogue that took place in the Tower of Orthanc, and therein Saruman refers to Gandalf as friend and helper. He treats him with respect and describes the full power of Mordor and of Sauron the Great. It can be gainsaid that Saruman did not plan the events that would later unfold, and that he was more controlled by Sauron than perhaps he was able to admit to himself. He may have planned to double-cross both sides, but there was still a bit in there. It is possible he let Gandalf live so he could see for himself the hopelessness of the opposition arrayed against the free peoples of Middle-earth. In the eye of Gandalf, there is no desire for power, only the fulfillment of his mission. As he says, our intentions will remain the same, only the means will change. It is important that a key issue for understanding Tolkien's work is the unoriginality of evil. In the world of Arda, there are few characters completely devoid of goodness, if any at all, but we must remember that villains rarely consider themselves as villains. This must be understood. Saruman most certainly did not see himself as the villain. Like we touched on in our previous video on whether Saruman was always evil or not, it is likely that his desire to obtain the Ring of Power did not grow out of the same will to dominate all life that Sauron had, but his desire to fix the problems he saw in Middle-earth, heal those diseases in his eyes. In his opinion, this could only be done by creating a new order, using the One Ring of Sauron against him and with the help of Gandalf. At the same time, he sees his way forward, even if Sauron recovered the ring first. By serving the Dark Lord, he thought there would be chances to find ways to cooperate, and was unable to recognize the extent to which he had been consumed by the penetrations into his mind made by the Palantir. Saruman was not an absolute evil, at least not by the point in the story we are here considering. Thus, for Saruman, the killing of Gandalf was really a bridge too far, an act of evil he could still recognize at that point as his mind was not yet so clouded by the intrusions of Sauron. It is true that he had long begrudged Gandalf the respect he earned from all corners of the world, but that does not mean he was not yet ready to murder his old friend. The dialogue between Gandalf and Saruman in Orthanc can be considered the crossroads of Saruman's internal conflict. He recognized that Gandalf would be a strong ally. He recognized his nobility, his strength, and the wisdom of his friend whether he would admit it or not, and this would not let him resort to murder. At least yet. He wanted instead to convince Gandalf of the inevitability of Mordor's victory and bring Gandalf to his side. And it is more likely that it would be difficult to convince Gandalf of these ideas. But at many moments within our story, we see that Saruman's voice is being wielded as his ultimate weapon, so to think it is impossible would not be in his mind. Again and again, he is able to bewitch and astound those whom he is speaking. the Nazgul, the guard set to keep him after the Ents have imprisoned him. Even Theoden and his men were almost turned when Saruman appealed to them after everything he had done. More likely it is that Saruman thought the retaking of the Ring of Power would have happened much earlier in the story, either as the hobbits had left the Shire or before they had even made it to Rivendell and the protection of Lord Elrond. He thought this would be demoralizing to Gandalf, and potentially enough to bring Gandalf to his side to fight against Sauron and evil as he understood it, or at least at a means by which he could strengthen his position, and not by so doing commit murder. And to murder another member of the White Council is nothing to what it would mean to murder another one of the Istari.
I gave you the chance of aiding me willingly, but you have elected pain!
Another thing that we must keep in mind is that Saruman had lost all faith in the power of the free peoples of Middle-earth, in the strength of Gondor, Rohan, and the elves that remained. The dwarves, by his reckoning, had not recovered from the devastation of Smaug in Erebor, the Balrog in Moria, and in principle could not continue the course of their civilization in Middle-earth without strong and determined leadership. The people were divided as never before. The book repeatedly stresses that the peoples of mortal races would never again have the will and power that was present in the War of the Last Alliance. Obviously, both Gandalf and Saruman understood this, and he believed that among men there was neither courage nor friendship. All this created the incorrect impression there was no hope for the free peoples to overcome this big threat of Sauron. This leads us to the most important point, and that is the Palantir and the influence of Sauron. All of the fears and doubts in Saruman's mind were reinforced by the will of Sauron. He revealed his plans to Saruman, dashing his hopes for the future of Middle-earth. Thanks to the Seeing Stone, he knew that Rohan would not prevent the fall of Gondor and would not come to their rescue due to their mutual distrust. The orcs of Sauron had already built up a huge army in the north, along with the undead of the resting place. He knew that troops of the Haradrim were coming from the east, and that pirates and mercenaries were moving too. Minas Tirith was likely to fall, and since he could not see the whole of the picture, it seemed ultimately hopeless and unlikely anyone could aid them in their hour of ultimate need. The picture Sauron was able to create within the White Wizard's mind was terrible. It was bleak. It relied on chance or luck, and this was in no way part of Saruman's character. And he had an absolute belief in his own abilities, not only to cope with the power of the ring, but in his abilities to subdue and use it for his own purposes. Hence the farce of Saruman of many colours, Saruman the Ringmaker, and so on. This is probably the way he felt he would be able to fulfill his mission when it really came down to it. Each of the wizards sent into Middle-earth had the choice to do as they choose, and each went their own way. Saruman might have thought that if he could not complete his mission after immediately taking the ring, then he was convinced that Sauron would at least take counsel with himself and Gandalf were they of one mind. Not knowing that Sauron is perhaps the second most stubborn being to ever live in Middle-earth. And who is the most, you may ask? Well, Feanor, of course, but that is a story for another day. But in the end, Saruman knew nothing about the Ringbearer, and did not believe in friendship or trust. He needed Gandalf because Gandalf knew about the movements of the ring and the ring bearer. Saruman had no idea how to look for the ring, who had it, or where it had gone. He had tried, and he had failed. It is more likely that he did not intend to kill Gandalf as much as he intended to hold him until he was able to extract this information from him, and not by friendly continued questioning either. Despite what scruples Saruman had left, it is unlikely he would have remained so restrained in his actions forever, and had Gandalf not managed to escape when he did, Saruman might well have killed him in the end. If, that is, he thought the Grey Wizard was no longer of benefit, and really at that point, too great of a threat to remain alive.
Embrace the power of the ring, or embrace your own destruction.
So there we have it. There are many reasons that Saruman may have let Gandalf live. It could be that he was not yet in a position to openly spill blood and transgress so broadly. It is possible he was not able to kill Gandalf because Gandalf had friends in high places, and the wheels that would set in motion would be too fast to stop. Not least of all Gwaihir and Radagast, but Eru himself is a good friend to have when the darkness seems most dark and the light most dim and far away. At the end of the day, Saruman was out for himself, and he believed he always knew best. So he believed it was the smartest thing to do to keep Gandalf alive at this time. However, we definitely cannot say he would never have reached that point where it would have been the option to take.
We must join with Sauron.
Saruman captured Gandalf at Orthanc, but he did not take Gandalf's ring. Gandalf carried Narya, one of the 3 elven rings. And Saruman, while he wanted power, he studied ring lore. He even called himself a ring maker. So, why did he leave one of the great rings in Gandalf's possession? Did he not know? Could he not take it? Or was Saruman already chasing something far more dangerous?
Build me an army worthy of Mordor.
The first thing to clear up is the scene itself, because the films make this question feel very simple. Saruman defeats Gandalf in a wizard duel. Gandalf is thrown across the chamber, beaten, disarmed, and left helpless. So naturally we ask, if Saruman had Gandalf at his mercy, why did he not take the ring from his hand? But in the book, well, that fight never happens. Gandalf is not knocked unconscious, he is not searched, he is not stripped of his possessions. He comes to Isengard because Saruman has summoned him, and at first Gandalf still hopes for counsel. Saruman is the head of his order after all, the White Wizard, the one who should be standing against Sauron. Instead, Gandalf finds something far worse. Saruman has already turned aside from his purpose. He does not openly serve Sauron in the simple sense, he is too proud for something like that. But he is no longer loyal to the mission of the Istari either. He has begun thinking in terms of power, control, survival. He believes the old way has failed. He believes Sauron cannot be defeated by resistance alone, and most importantly, he wants knowledge of the One Ring. So when Gandalf refuses him, Saruman does not beat him into submission and loot his hand. He imprisons him. Gandalf is taken to the pinnacle of Orthanc and just left there, high above Isengard, trapped between stone and sky. So this makes us have to rethink the whole question, as Saruman is not treating Gandalf like a defeated soldier with treasure to steal. He is treating him like a locked door. Gandalf knows things Saruman desperately wants to know. Where is the ring? Who has it? How close is it to being found? Does Sauron know? Those are questions Saruman cares about. Gandalf's value is not what he is wearing, it is what he knows. So the first answer is simple. The book does not give us a scene where Saruman physically overpowers Gandalf, searches him, and somehow misses Narya. It gives us something colder. Saruman traps Gandalf because he thinks Gandalf may lead him to the only ring he truly wants. And that one is the One. Now, Gandalf's ring is Narya, the Ring of Fire, one of the 3, and of course that means it is incredibly important, but it does not make it the kind of power Saruman was really looking for. The 3 elven rings were not made as weapons of conquest. Their purpose was not to build armies, crush enemies, or force others to obey. Their power was quieter than that. It was in preservation, healing, endurance, resistance against decay, and in Narya's case, the kindling of courage. This is why it suited Gandalf so perfectly. He does not want to rule a kingdom. He does not command armies in the ordinary way. He walks from place to place, encouraging people who are afraid, weary, divided, or close to despair. Narya strengthens that work. It is not a crown, it is not a throne, it is not a weapon, it is a hidden fire. And Saruman has moved away from that kind of power. By the time Gandalf reaches Orthanc, Saruman wants something much harder and much colder. He wants command, order, engines, walls, spies, armies, furnaces, servants. He wants the power to impose his will on the world. Narya, it does not offer that. But the One Ring does. That is crucial. Narya can help hearts resist darkness. The One Ring promises mastery. and Saruman by this point is no longer interested in helping others endure. He wants to be the one who decides what the world becomes. This is why Narya may have mattered to him emotionally, but not strategically. It was a symbol of something he hated. Gandalf had been trusted with one of the three. Gandalf the Wanderer, the Grey Pilgrim, the one who seemed less impressive, commanding, or grand. But Saruman did not merely want what Gandalf had. He wanted to surpass it. If he could find the One Ring, then Narya would become a lesser prize. The three themselves would be caught in the shadow of the ruling ring. So at Orthanc, Saruman's attention is fixed beyond Gandalf's hand. He is looking for the road to something greater, or at least something he believes is greater. And that is where his wisdom collapses into pride. Because Saruman thinks he is choosing the stronger power. But really he is choosing the power that has already begun to master it. This is where the question becomes more difficult. If we only had the Lord of the Rings, the easiest answer would be that Saruman simply did not know Gandalf had Narya. The three are hidden, they are not spoken of openly, even Frodo only sees Gandalf's ring clearly at the very end, when the keepers of the three are leaving Middle-earth. So from the main story alone, Saruman's silence about Narya would not feel strange. But Tolkien's later writings complicate this. In the Unfinished Tales, we are told that Círdan gave Narya to Gandalf when he arrived in Middle-earth. Círdan saw that Gandalf would need it for the labour ahead, and Saruman later became aware of this gift. So think about it. This means Saruman's jealousy of Gandalf was not vague, it had a specific wound at its heart. Saruman was the White Wizard. Saruman was the head of the council. Saruman was the great master of law. And yet, Saruman was not the one to be given one of the three. No, not to him, but to Gandalf. You can almost feel how that would poison him. Because Saruman's fall is not only about ambition, it is about resentment. He cannot bear the idea that others see something in Gandalf that he refuses to recognise. Círdan trusts Gandalf. Galadriel wants Gandalf to lead the White Council. And even at Orthanc, Gandalf is the one person Saruman cannot bend. So yes, in the wider Legendarium, Saruman probably knew or at least strongly suspected that Gandalf possessed Narya. And that means we cannot solve the question too neatly. If Saruman knew Gandalf had the Ring of Fire, why would he never mention it? Why does he not demand it? Why does he not try and take it? And the honest answer is probably a mixture of story logic and Tolkien's developing ideas. Within the scene itself, Saruman is obsessed with the One Ring. Gandalf's knowledge matters more than Gandalf's possessions. Narya is not the power Saruman is chasing. But outside of the scene, Tolkien later deepened the history between Gandalf and Saruman in a way that makes the moment at Orthanc more awkward. It may be a small tension in the Legendarium, not a disaster, not some great collapse of the story, but a tension. And sometimes those are the most interesting parts of Tolkien's world, because they show us how the legend grew over time. So, at the end of the day, Saruman's failure to take Narya tells us less about Gandalf's ring than it tells us about Saruman himself. He could understand the One Ring, or at least he thought he could. He understood power that ruled, power that commanded, power that bent others' wills beneath his own. That kind of power, well, that's what made sense to him. But Narya was different. Narya was the fire that kept courage alive when courage should have failed. It was the strength to keep going when the road seemed hopeless. It was the quiet force behind Gandalf's true work in Middle-earth, not ruling people, but awakening them. And Saruman had lost the ability to value that. By the time Gandalf stood before him at Orthanc, Saruman was no longer interested in hidden fires. He wanted the blazing crown, he wanted the Master Ring, he wanted the power that would make others kneel. So whether Saruman could not take Narya, did not think of it useful, or simply looked beyond it toward the One, the result ends up the same. He missed the kind of power that actually defeated Sauron. Not domination, not machinery, not fear, but hope, endurance, pity, and courage in small hands. The very things Saruman had come to despise. So, why did Saruman not take Gandalf's ring? Because Narya was never the ring his fallen mind truly wanted. And perhaps by then, it was also the ring he was least capable of understanding. Saruman the White, the head of the Istari, leader of the White Council, the wisest of the wizards. At least that's how he was introduced to us. But when Gandalf confronts him in the Fellowship of the Ring, something has changed. Saruman no longer calls himself the White. Instead, he now reveals himself as Saruman of Many Colours, a name as ominous as it is confusing. What does this transformation actually mean, and why does Tolkien make such a big deal out of it? Let's look at this today.
For you have come, and that was all the purpose of my message. And here you will stay, Gandalf the Grey, and rest from journeys. For I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of Many Colours. I looked then and saw that his robes, which had seemed white, were not so, but were woven of all colours, and if he moved they shimmered and changed hue so that the eye was bewildered. I liked white better, I said.
Before we can understand why Saruman abandoned white, we have to understand why it mattered in the first place. In Tolkien's world, white is a symbol of purity, wisdom, and uncorrupted power. From the earliest days in the Silmarillion, light and whiteness are linked to divine creation. The two trees of Valinor, Telperion and Lorelin, shone with holy light, and their last remnants became the Silmarils, the most sacred and contested objects in Tolkien's legendarium. The White Tree of Numenor, descended from Telperion, was a living emblem of that light, and its destruction by Sauron marked Numenor's spiritual downfall. Later, Gondor's White Tree served the same purpose, a sign that the realm still carried the grace of the West. White wasn't just about beauty, it was about an unbroken connection to wisdom, to righteousness, to something greater than the mortal world. This theme carries over into the White Council, the alliance of Middle-earth's wisest figures, created to resist Sauron. Even Gandalf's resurrection as Gandalf the White reinforces the point. White is a mark of true wisdom, power, and responsibility. And at the top of this hierarchy, Saruman the White, the head of the Istari. His titles signified that he was supposed to be the purest, the wisest, the leader of the fight against darkness. But as we see, Saruman was never truly worthy of the white he wore. We had the 5 wizards, Saruman, Gandalf, Radagast, and the mysterious 2 blue wizards. Each was assigned a colour when they were sent to Middle-earth. These weren't random choices, as each colour reflected something about their nature and their role. Gandalf the Grey, he was humble, unassuming, a wanderer who dealt with the common folk. Radagast the Brown, a wizard more connected to the natural world than to men or elves. The blue wizards, the ones little is known about, but their name suggests that they ventured far into the unknown lands of the east. And then of course, Saruman the White, the leader, the greatest of them all. White was a symbol of knowledge and authority, and Saruman in his arrogance believed himself to be above all others. But Saruman's problem was pride. He saw himself as superior, truly believed it, and he despised the idea that he was merely a servant of the Valar. Over time, he sought more power, more knowledge, especially knowledge of Sauron and the Rings of Power. And that is where things went wrong. When Gandalf visits Saruman in Orthanc, he finds that Saruman has shed his old title. He is no longer the White. Instead, Saruman reveals his robes of shifting, shimmering colours and proclaims himself Saruman of Many Colours. He dismisses the old meaning of white, saying, "White cloth may be dyed, the white page can be overwritten, and the white light can be broken." But Gandalf isn't impressed. He understands what it means and replies with, "In which case, it is no longer white." This moment is crucial. Saruman is telling us exactly why he abandoned white, because he thinks he's surpassed it. He sees white as just a starting point, something simple and incomplete. In his mind, by breaking it apart into many colours, he has become something greater. But Tolkien is making an important point here. Saruman hasn't improved himself, he's corrupted himself. White contains all colours in harmony. By shattering it into individual colours, Saruman has lost the unity, the purity, and the wisdom that white represents. He's diluted himself, spread himself too thin, like butter over too much bread. And in doing so, he has abandoned the very qualities that once made him great. Gandalf says, "He that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom." It is a direct condemnation of Saruman's mindset. Saruman's hunger for power and knowledge has led him down a path of destruction. Instead of serving the world, he now seeks to control it. And worse, he believes that in doing so, he's doing something clever. From this point forward, Saruman is no longer the White. He has lost that title in every way that matters. And as we see throughout the story, his many colours don't make him stronger, they make him less than what he once was. He betrays the White Council, he allies with Sauron, believing he can master him, which is honestly a bit laughable. He industrializes Isengard, destroying the land to fuel his war machine. And in the end, he falls so far that he's reduced to ruling over a band of thugs in the Shire and calls himself Sharky. The once mighty White Wizard ends his days as nothing more than a bitter old man ruling over a ruined village. Meanwhile, Gandalf, the wizard Saruman always looked down on, becomes the White in his place. When Gandalf returns as Gandalf the White, he takes on the mantle that Saruman abandoned. And in doing so, he proves that wisdom isn't about hoarding power. It's about humility, service, and standing against evil without seeking to dominate others. And what happens to Saruman? His multicolored visions of power end in complete failure. His staff is broken, his voice loses its magic, and he dies a petty tyrant, stabbed in the back by his own servant. He never achieves the greatness he believed was his destiny, and in the end, he disappears as a grey mist, fading into nothingness. Tolkien leaves us with a clear lesson. Wisdom isn't about breaking things apart, it's about keeping them whole. Saruman thought he was too great for White, but in the end, he wasn't even worthy of it. So, there we have it. Saruman's many colours weren't an upgrade, they were a downgrade. He thought he was evolving, but in reality he was just losing himself. White represented unity, wisdom and purpose, and Saruman in his arrogance thought he could improve upon it, but instead he shattered it. And that is why, in the end, Gandalf the White took his place. Because true wisdom isn't found in pride, ambition or the pursuit of control. It's found in clarity, humility, and the strength to stand for what is right. Saruman broke White to seek power, but in the end, it broke him.
"What's the danger?" asked Pippin. "Will he shoot at us and pour fire out of the windows? Or can he put a spell on us from a distance?" "The last is more likely, if you ride to his door with a light heart," said Gandalf. "But there is no knowing what he can do, or may choose to try. A wild beast cornered is not safe to approach, and Saruman has powers you do not guess. Beware his voice."
Before we dive into today's video, I want to give a quick shout out to our other channel, the Tabletop Alliance. If you're a fan of Middle-earth strategy battle game or MESBG, it is well worth checking out. So whether you're into epic battle reports, army discussions, painting tips, or staying up to date with the latest news, there is something for every Middle-earth fan. So if that sounds like your thing, head over and join the Alliance. But now, let's get on with the video. To truly understand Saruman's abilities, we must begin with his origins. Saruman, originally known as Carumo in the West, was a Maya of Aule the Smith, one of the Valar. Aule's domain over craftsmanship, invention, and the manipulation of the physical world heavily influenced Saruman's foundational knowledge and skills.
Under Aule's tutelage, Karumo mastered the art of creation and control, developing a deep understanding of both the forces that govern Middle-earth and the methods of bending them to his will. As a Maya, Saruman was an immortal being predating the world itself. His very essence was imbued with power and insight, capable of shaping and influencing the world around him. Unlike elves or men, Maiar possessed abilities far beyond mortal comprehension, and Saruman's potential was immense from the outset. Saruman's time with Aule gave him a unique perspective. Aule, often associated with crafting and material mastery as we've said, was also the creator of the dwarves. Saruman absorbed this knowledge. This connection explains his eventual fascination with Sauron, who was also a Maya of Aule before his corruption. In the Third Age of Middle-earth, Saruman was chosen by the Valar to be one of the Istari, the order of wizards sent to Middle-earth to aid its free peoples against Sauron. As the first to arrive and the most learned of the Istari, Saruman was appointed the head of their order. This position elevated his status, granting him authority among the free peoples and access to ancient knowledge. Even from the outset, Saruman harbored jealousy towards Gandalf, who was seen as his equal despite arriving later. His rivalry subtly influenced his decisions, especially as he sought to outshine Gandalf's wisdom with his knowledge and his power. Saruman's study of Sauron was initially intended to combat the Dark Lord. That was his mission. However, his fascination grew into an obsession. His desire to understand the Rings of Power and Sauron's methods really became a driving force, leading him to delve deeply into forbidden lore. Saruman believed that mastering Sauron's techniques was the only way to surpass him, a belief that would define his later actions. Saruman's abilities defined his immense influence and were pivotal to both his rise and his actions. His magic was not always overt. It often manifested through subtle manipulation, careful strategy, and masterful control over others. Arguably, his most feared ability, the one that Gandalf talked about in the quote we did at the beginning, was his voice, and his voice was a weapon that could manipulate even the strongest wills. Tolkien describes it as possessing an almost hypnotic quality, one that could inspire, deceive, or bend others to his will. Saruman's mastery of speech allowed him to dominate minds without lifting a finger, making him a unique threat among the Istari. If we think of some key examples, we have Theoden at Orthanc. Even after his defeat at Helm's Deep, Saruman's voice nearly convinced Theoden to reconcile, presenting a false vision of peace. And of course you have to look no further than Grima Wormtongue. Saruman's influence over him transformed him into a pawn within Rohan's court, sowing distrust and weakening Theoden's role. But Saruman's voice was not absolute. Strong-willed individuals like Gandalf, Aragorn, or Gimli could resist its effects. Its influence was most effective when it preyed upon people's doubt or insecurities. Saruman was infatuated by ring lore and wished to rival Sauron himself. As the head of the White Council, he was Middle-earth's foremost scholar on the Rings of Power. His deep study of these artifacts drove much of his ambition, and he sought to replicate Sauron's craft. For those of you who don't know, Saruman created his own ring during his time in Isengard. Nothing to the likes of the One Ring, but definitely a lesser ring. And while its abilities are not described in detail, it symbolized his intent to rival Sauron and his mastery over subtle enchantments. And if we look at another item he held within Orthanc, with this being one of the Palantir, Saruman used the Seeing Stone of Orthanc to gain knowledge and coordinate his plans. However, this tool also became his downfall as it brought him under Sauron's influence. Beyond all this, Saruman's powers extended to manipulating the natural and material world. His time under Aule of course endowed him with unparalleled skill in craftsmanship and invention, which he did use when he came to Middle-earth. If we look at the battle at Helm's Deep, Saruman's forces used an explosive substance to breach the Deeping Wall, showcasing his ability to blend magic with technology, really. This weapon shocked his enemies and demonstrated the destructive potential of his craft. He also twisted the land of Isengard into a barren industrial wasteland to fuel his forges and war machines. His destruction of Fangorn Forest also became part of his downfall, bringing him into direct conflict with the Ents, sealing his fate. But it wasn't just inanimate objects. Saruman's ability to breed and command creatures added a terrifying dimension to his power. He wielded armies of fighting Uruk-hai, twisted versions of orcs bred for strength, endurance, and resistance to sunlight. His greatest military achievement was these hybrid soldiers, who were faster, stronger, and more disciplined than those traditional orcs. They became his primary weapon against Rohan and the Fellowship. But there are also smaller creatures under his control. Saruman employed crow-like spies, the Crebain of Dunland, to spy and monitor Middle-earth, gathering intelligence on the movements of his enemies, a very useful thing to have. But if we look further into his powers again, Saruman's cunning extended to his use of illusions and subtle deceptions, enhancing his ability to confuse and manipulate. Like if we look at Grima's corruption, Saruman did not always rely on direct power. His ability to subtly twist minds, as we saw with Wormtongue, exemplifies his mastery of deception. Saruman's powers, as you can see, were vast and varied, each tailored to his ambition to dominate. Whether through his voice, his creations, or his influence over others, he wielded his abilities with a level of precision that few could rival. Yet, as we will see, even these extraordinary powers would have their limitations. Beyond his magical abilities, as we've said, Saruman's cunning as a strategist and manipulator solidified his place as one of Middle-earth's most dangerous figures. He was a master of leveraging alliances, exploiting weaknesses, and wielding influence to achieve his goals. Saruman's rise to leadership in the White Council was really a sign of his intellect and commanding presence. Chosen over Gandalf to head the council, he initially appeared committed to opposing Sauron, and he really probably was. His vast knowledge of ring lore and his status of one of the Istari did earn him great respect among elves, men, and wizards alike. However, even during this period, his motivations became questionable fast. While Saruman supported the attack on Dol Guldur in 2941, his true reason was likely to undermine Sauron and gain control over the One Ring for himself. His refusal to take decisive action at other critical moments revealed a calculated strategy to serve his own interests rather than Middle-earth's. When Gondor granted Saruman stewardship over Orthanc and Isengard, he would transform the region into a fortress of industry and power. His command over Isengard marked a bit of a turning point for his ambitions. This may even be the moment that everything changed. He fortified the tower, he established forges, and he began breeding those infamous Uruk-hai. Saruman's manipulation of the Palantir in Orthanc was what allowed him to observe events across Middle-earth as well. But of course, like we've said already, this tool was part of his undoing, as Sauron used it to exert influence over him, further twisting Saruman's ambitions. If we look at his relationship with Rohan, Saruman's calculated betrayal of Rohan exemplifies his strategic acumen. Exploiting the grievances of the Dunlendings, he incited them to war against the Rohirrim, creating a network of allies through promises of power and revenge, and a lot of lies along the way. His manipulation extended to Theoden, king of Rohan. As we have already covered today, it was Grima Wormtongue who was key to this. Saruman weakened Theoden's will, kept him under a spell of apathy, rendering Rohan invulnerable. This strategy was nearly completely successful as well, as Rohan's defences truly crumbled under his raids and attacks. Saruman's most ambitious military campaign was the Siege of Helm's Deep. By combining his army of Uruk-hai with advanced siege weaponry like the Blasting Fire, Saruman truly sought to annihilate the Rohirrim and cement his dominance over Rohan. His forces, capable of marching under the sun and withstanding fierce resistance, represented almost the pinnacle of his military innovations. Yet, his overconfidence and underestimation of his enemies, particularly Gandalf's intervention and the courage of the Rohirrim, would lead to his defeat. This marked a turning point, as Saruman's failure at Helm's Deep began his descent into, really, irrelevance. Saruman's influence extended far beyond just Isengard, though. His extensive network of spies and informants were truly spread across Middle-earth. As we touched upon, the Crebain of Dunland acted as his eyes in the wild, while his agents operated in places like Bree and the South Farthing. His interest in the Shire all stemmed from his suspicion of Gandalf's focus on the region, which led him to exploit it economically and politically. Perhaps his most audacious act of deception, though, was misleading the Nazgul, After all, they came to his gates, they came seeking the One Ring, but he managed to feign ignorance to them. Saruman temporarily shielded his own designs, showcased his ability to manipulate even Sauron's most powerful servants. Although it would have been interesting to see what may have happened had Saruman and the Nazgul come head to head, Saruman was too wise and smart to let this come to pass. And so, there we have it. Saruman was one of the most powerful figures in Middle-earth, with his magic, his voice, and his cunning strategies making him a force to be reckoned with. But at the end of the day, his ambition and arrogance brought him down. His talents, like his ability to sway minds and his knowledge of ring lore, were truly incredible, there's no doubt about it, but they were ultimately wasted in his quest for control. It is truly fascinating to think what might have been if Saruman had just stayed true to his mission.
In today's video, we will look at the strengths and weaknesses of two characters, one aligned with the Dark Lord Sauron, and one just feigning to. The loyalty of the first is unquestioned, but the allegiance of the latter is his own, as are his dark counsels. In this video, we answer a question submitted to us on Patreon. Is Saruman able to destroy the Nazgul, generally speaking? And in particular, what might happen if Saruman of many colours should come between the Nazgul and its prey? Let us start today with Saruman of many colours. He is an ancient being of great power, and his voice has powers of persuasion that border on hypnosis, a power we've seen used by a few different characters throughout Tolkien's Legendarium, notably put to use by Glaurung, Father of Dragons, and to great effect back in the First Age. When considering what may happen if these two went toe-to-toe, we have to keep these issues in mind, but we cannot be overly dedicated to the letter of the rules as established in universe. We've seen this time and again in Tolkien's writing, that of a less powerful or unlikely figure rising to the challenge and overcoming what might otherwise seem unlikely or even impossible on paper. Saruman's drive and ambition in the film seem to represent a loyal servant to the Dark Lord. The Nazgul are powerful creatures if they close the distance between the foe and their knife. Saruman, however, has the ability to speak as though reason and contrivance of logic was magic in its own right. The voice of Saruman is able to convince, and it's not purely magic, it is a gift, one that has been nurtured by Saruman's many years of study in the ancient lore while he maintained the fortress at Isengard. We must also acknowledge, Saruman and Sauron are of the same kin. That is, they are of the lower chorus of Ainur, the lesser angelic spirits, each with a given domain and purpose within the working of the world and its universe, which are of course called the Maiar. Saruman too thinks himself something of a ringmaker, a bit like Sauron as well, although never anywhere close to his level. He gets first mentioned in the stories by Gandalf when he tells Frodo of his strange behaviour in the years after Bilbo's party and subsequent departure. A time that really began to change the White Wizard. But what about the Witch King? The Ringwraiths, likewise, are completely divested of their mortal remains. They stalk the footsteps of the hobbits along their route under cloaks that render them into black men who go about in the dark. Another change to the book is interesting because it gives us a look at the Witch King's character that isn't really shown in the movies. As Frodo is readying himself to leave the Shire, he hears someone calling on him. He pays it no mind but remembers this moment. The stranger who came asking for Baggins. This was Camul, second in command after the Witch King. He was the one almost on Bilbo's very doorstep. But this kind of mental power is definitely something that the Witch King possesses too. This brief example gives us a look at the Nazgul. That is, their intelligence and active measures they have been shown to take of their own volition. The Nazgul are not mindless, empty vessels, but intelligent beings. They are not unintelligent vessels, or, like orcs, merely fingers of the Dark Lord's malice which spread over and across the lands of Middle-earth. There is much of what drives Sauron and his lust for power in those who serve him. The rings which granted them such unnatural long life came with unintended side effects. Notably that of gradually fading out of being, losing all corporal form and attachment to the good earth. Except in Sauron and perhaps Tom Bombadil, it is likely Saruman was the most powerful being in Middle-earth, and contested in that only by a handful of characters ever, and those capable of truly resisting him at the height of his powers was a small collection indeed, though his powers have diminished by the end. In their reunion at Isengard, Merry even explains to Aragorn what had befallen the trapped wizard prior to their arrival. They pushed, pulled, tore, shook and hammered, and clang, bang, crash, crack. In 5 minutes they had these huge gates just lying in ruin. And some were already beginning to eat into the walls, like rabbits in a sandpit. I don't know what Saruman thought was happening, but anyway, he did not know how to deal with it. His wizardry may have been falling off lately, of course, but anyway, I think he has not much grit, not much plain courage alone in a tight place without a lot of slaves and machines and things, if you know what I mean. Very different from old Gandalf. I wonder if his fame was not all along mainly due to his cleverness in settling at Isengard. No, said Aragorn. Once he was as great as his fame made him. His knowledge was deep, his thought was subtle, and his hands marvellously skilled. And he had a power over the minds of others. The wise he could persuade, the smaller folk he could daunt. That power he certainly still keeps. There are not many in Middle-earth that I should say were safe if they were left alone to talk with him, even now when he has suffered a defeat. Gandalf, Elrond and Galadriel, perhaps, now that his wickedness has been laid bare, but very few others. His abilities to persuade would be of little use to the Witch King as depicted in the Peter Jackson films, but against a Black Captain who can follow clues and seek out hobbits, their obvious intellect makes them more, not less, vulnerable against a foe like Saruman. Let's not forget that he was able to imprison Gandalf within the walls of Orthanc, which is different from the scene in the film where Gandalf is basically made to headspin on the floor. It was even considered that Saruman might attempt to capture the Nazgul, or the entire company of them within Orthanc, as Gandalf tells Frodo. He has powers still, I think, while in Orthanc, to resist the Nine Riders. He may try to do so. He may try to trap the Nazgul, or at least to slay the thing on which it now rides the air. That Saruman would dare to attempt such a thing speaks of his skills, his confidence, and to some degree the notion it was a possibility. For all his flaws, and they are numerous, we get no indication Saruman is outright stupid. Misled, sure. Misguided, definitely. But he was no fool. What this would do in an outright fight between he and the Witch King is hard to say, as it is unlikely to result in any physical combat, unless Saruman gets within reach of the great black mace wielded by the Black Captain, unlike the flail he equips during the Battle of the Pelennor Fields in Return of the King. There are other abilities not shown to us in the films that might surprise non-book readers, like the way he conceives of and employs the use of illusions. Most of what we learn of Saruman is second-hand information, but the sources are trustworthy, so it is hard to not take them as fact. When speaking to Gimli, who had just said he wished to see if Saruman really looked like Gandalf, if you've ever read the book, Gandalf's answer is quite surprising. He says, "And how will you learn that, Master Dwarf?" said Gandalf. "Saruman could look like me in your eyes, if it suited his purpose with you. And are you yet wise enough to detect all his counterfeits?" Another example of this comes from what Gandalf suggests when he is, for all intents and purposes, trapped, ironically, in the most secure fortress in Middle-earth. Pippin asks. "What's the danger?" asked Pippin. "Will he shoot at us, or pour fire out of the windows, or can he put a smell on us from a distance?" "The last is most likely, if you ride to his door with a light heart," said Gandalf. "But there is no knowing what he can do, or may choose to try. A wild beast cornered is not safe to approach, and Saruman has powers you do not guess. Beware of his voice." With all of this, though, I wouldn't say it is a foregone conclusion. It is possible that on a good day the Witch King could still take out Saruman. If we look at what Peregrine Took says to Lord Denethor when asked how he, a mere halfling, had survived while the great captain of Gondor, Boromir, had died. "The mightiest man may be slain by one arrow," he said, "and Boromir was pierced by many. If the same can be applied to Saruman, to what extent his incarnate body is truly immortal can only be guessed at. We know when he dies, he gets killed with just a simple knife in the scouring of the Shire when he is known as Sharky. Now, whether he could withstand anything more than that when at a higher level of his power is hard to say, but I do not feel it would affect the durability of his body much at all. After all, the Istari were given old bodies for a purpose. Bodies meant not to be tested too hard. That was never the purpose of their journey. A fight between the two, though, if it came down to it, might play out the following way. Saruman has made it clear to Sauron that he intends to be more than a mere vessel of a greater darkness, and reveals himself to Sauron as the Ringmaker, a multicoloured wizard that he so desired to be. Sauron's laughter would give way to mystification, not the least of which the sudden turn in attitude, but the change in clothing was able to shock the Dark Lord in a way that one would think impossible. An immortal spirit with the drive and determination to dominate the world is not the best co-pilot, and Sauron lets it be known that the Nine will be shortly to celebrate his new career path. They arrive by way of their foul beasts, while the Black Captain is in the vanguard and his flaming blade is held aloft. In the movies, the wizardry at work on the Fellowship as they attempt to cross the Caradhras is shown to be Saruman's doing. In the book, it is not this simple, and it may well be Sauron's doing that drives them underground and into Moria. But the power itself is not beyond Saruman, so as the foul beasts drive through the air and the darkness splits with the violence of sudden lightning as the flaming sword breaks against the battlements of Isengard, Saruman's voice echoes through the air and he speaks in a foreign tongue. The sky turns into a whirling tempest, and the clouds begin to cloud the vision of the Witch King, disorientating the other Nazgul, drawing the Witch King himself into an individual encounter. The Witch King descends and disappears in a cloud of dust, making with the darkness about him as he attempts to slip by Saruman. But before he can drive the blade home, and true, the robe of many colours is so off-putting that an audible gasp gives away his position, and in his wrath, Saruman forces another foe to break down against their will. The Witch King is sent high into the heavens and passes by the high stars once more. He is derobed, locked down, and unable to escape. A prisoner now of Isengard, a prisoner of Saruman. With that, the other Nazgul flee back. With their leader imprisoned, they stand no chance, and Saruman has shown off some of his true power. So there we have it, a fun answer to a hypothetical question, and his purpose in doing so was really to mainly inform on the story and elements of that story which may not be as widely known. We have looked at what if Saruman took on the Witch King, and at the end of it all, one of the Maiar, the most powerful of the Istari sent to Middle-earth, would surely be too much for the leader of the Nazgul. Yes, the Witch King may have been imbued with the power of Sauron and a great leader of his armies, but when it came to challenging more than just beings who feel fear quickly, those with great magical abilities too, that did not mean certain victory. We must also remember that in The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf was able to fight off several of the Nazgul when he travelled as the Grey, and he was weaker than Saruman at this time. So this is another strong factor to show Saruman would have the power to overcome his opponent. Saruman was a very smart being. He would know to daze and confuse the Nazgul as a group, with splitting them up being the safest course of action. If he could subdue the Witch King quickly, the others would not follow. So by the powers of his voice, his fortress, and his magic, Saruman to me would be our winner.
When Gandalf recounts the story of the One Ring to Frodo after years of mysterious comings and goings, checking here and there on Frodo's health, never staying long and never saying much, we eventually learn the cause for his concern. That the One Ring, the Ring of Sauron, had returned, and it was right before his eyes. First coming to Bilbo before being passed on to Frodo, his heir, taken in as a tween after his parents drowned. What Gandalf conveys is that all he had was a suspicion, but that was nothing compared to the knowledge of Saruman, the head of his order and the master of all ring lore. Saruman convinced Gandalf that the One Ring was lost, at the bottom of the sea, but the shadow which fell on Gandalf's heart insisted that this was wrong. How wrong it was he could not know until Saruman betrayed him and their mission at Orthanc. In today's video we are going to look at Saruman the Ringmaker, a name he gave himself, and the Rings of Isengard. First of all, it needs to be said that Isengard, and the larger structure of which is at its centre Orthanc, was not created by or for Saruman, but rather by the Númenóreans in exile after the downfall of Númenor and their coming to Middle-earth in Gondor and Arnor. Isengard was built between 3320 of the Second Age and the time of the War of the Last Alliance in 3430. It was in the northwest of the Kingdom of Gondor and was purposed as a guard to the Fords of Isen, and as such was gifted to Saruman the White by the Steward of Gondor, Beren, thinking the wizard would be a strong ally and buffer against the threat of the Dunlendins, who, as people, were in constant conflict with Rohan, and so with their ally of Gondor as well. Saruman was intended to be a steward of Orthanc, not its master, much in the same way the stewards of Gondor were guards for and not heirs to the royalty that they kept vacant until such a time a king should return and prove worthy. We can make some interesting comparisons between the steward of Gondor at the time of the War of the Ring, Denethor, and Saruman himself. Denethor, who told his son when asked that 10,000 years would not be sufficient enough time for a steward to take power as king in such a land as Gondor. Saruman was less scrupulous than Denethor though. Here we are talking about a man who went mad and attempted to set himself and his son on fire. The difference between them goes even further, however. For example, while Saruman was corrupted through his intention with Sauron through the Palantiri, Denethor waged a war of wills against the Dark Lord for nigh on 30 years before he broke, and when he broke, he still did not turn to the side of Sauron. Despite losing his critical faculty and despairing of all hope, he never turned to evil. As for Saruman, we know that he acted as though he was on Sauron's side, though he was desperately seeking out the ring for himself. When the Nazgul pass by Orthanc and they encounter Grima, Saruman speaks to their very thought and tells them that he knows what they are looking for. And though, if he had it, he tells them, he would not need to say so. Rather, they would throw themselves at his feet and name him Lord. This speaks to Saruman's ultimate aspirations, and not least of all his aspiration to own the One Ring itself, but to forge the rings of power of his own sorcery and lore, all of which in his new home of secrecy and power, Orthanc. Saruman refers to himself as Ringmaker, and we are unwilling to trust the word of a known traitor and liar. We can trust Gandalf, who notes on numerous occasions that Saruman is wearing a ring. It is Gandalf who recounts the series of events from which the name Saruman of Many Colours originated. But I rode to the foot of Orthanc, and came to the stair of Saruman, and there he met me and led me up to his high chamber. He wore a ring on his finger. I am Saruman the Wise, Saruman Ringmaker, Saruman of Many Colours. Now remember, it was Gandalf who told us that his intuition was nothing against the stature of Saruman in his studies of ring lore, as he had long studied what was his domain of study, while Gandalf had only an inclination, and in such a position he did not think just intuition was enough to go against the head of his order, as Gandalf was an honourable and noble spirit. Not exactly words that one would use to describe Saruman, whether he be white or many-coloured. It is possible that what Gandalf sees on Saruman's finger was a taunt, a feint, a way to convey strength that is purely illusionary. In keeping with the powers of his voice, he attempts to use at several times in the story, most prominently against Theoden, when their company rise to Isengard after the Battle of Helm's Deep. Theoden is able to shrug off Saruman's attempts at undermining Gandalf and his position, but only just, and only after Theoden's men begin murmuring in agreement with Saruman among themselves. It is in keeping with Saruman's character that he would wear a ring without powers as a means of conveying power, just as he was to proclaim himself no longer Saruman the White, but Saruman of Many Colours. He was not satisfied with his lot and intended to increase his power at whatever price. Treason, murder, whatever it took, he intended to be master. As Sauron suspected of all people who would oppose him, he would attempt to use the ring against Sauron and replace him, not destroy the ring to rid the world of evil. There was a problem though. It might be that he would need to get his hands on the One Ring itself to reverse engineer it, and as a master of ring lore, it is likely he knew that if he attempted to wield the One Ring, it might not serve him as it did Sauron. But in the time he had, the years, decades or centuries with which he had to inquire into the lore and the craft, certainly he would learn of Celebrimbor, the forging of the Rings of Power, and all that we would come to learn throughout the book. What is in the province of the wise would be something expected of Saruman to know, lest he be no longer counted among the wise. It is perhaps this egotism that drove Saruman astray. We know that from his time coming into the world, when Círdan gave the Ring of Fire to Gandalf, Saruman was furious and undoubtedly never forgot this slight on his person, his worthiness and his ability. At the time of The Lord of the Rings, when we first meet him, it is likely that he is already in a race against time to either acquire the ring by way of sending his own agents out of Orthanc to acquire it, as we know that there were the three groups of orcs that the three hunters pursued, those of Mordor, those of Isengard, and those unaffiliated orcs of Moria, who followed after the Fellowship to avenge the death of their chieftain, who was killed by a member of the Fellowship. With the orcs of Isengard wanting to return them to Saruman, the orcs of Mordor obviously wanted to return them to Mordor, to Sauron. The unaffiliated orcs were just in a blood feud with the Fellowship and had little concern about rings, only the blood of their enemies to avenge their fallen comrade. Interestingly, in this scenario of a Maya and a member of the Istari, only this one group of orcs acted selflessly and noble among those three groups. When the orcs are the high-minded group in any party, something has gone horribly wrong. This brings us back to what is one of the central thematic elements of The Lord of the Rings, and a thematic thread which runs through the whole of the work. The ambitious and selfish are doomed to fail because they will be blinded by their ego, by their ambitions, and lose objectivity of thought and become blinded to the dangers and the risk of what they seek. Again and again, what is meant to empower someone is often what becomes their prison. As the 9 mortal men who wasted away and became wraiths, their pursuit of power drained them of life entirely, to the point they only hold shape by covering their fell spirits in black cloaks. The Tower of Isengard itself, bequeathed to Saruman as an ally by the Steward Beren, first became a symbol of strength and fortification, and at the story's end, the Ents have Saruman trapped within those very walls. And what's worse, he's stuck inside with Grima Wormtongue, and since Grima threw the Palantiri out of the window trying to strike Gandalf, he has no one else to talk to, though he eventually gets to leave, only to later meet his end by Wormtongue's blade. What power he sought that was beyond his nature sent him down a path of corruption, blackening his soul and stripping him of any right to the position which was conferred upon him. Just as the Silmarils were so hotly pursued by the Sons of Fëanor, they had done so much evil in their pursuit that when they finally acquired the Hallowed Gems, they burned their hands. The wickedness of their deeds in seeking the Silmarils made them unworthy of possessing them. So it is with Saruman, the wickedness of his pursuit made him unworthy of his position, and when his body burned away and turned to ash, scattering in the wind, we see the end to all such missions in Middle-earth, because in this world it is so ordered by Eru Ilúvatar that despite the presence of evil, goodness will prevail. Saruman was a spiteful, grudge-bearing and deeply envious being. His pursuit of the ring was purely for his own purposes, to make himself master of Middle-earth, to supplant Sauron by using the One Ring, or one like it, against the Dark Lord so that he could take his place. Unlike Galadriel, who was able to resist the temptation of the ring when Frodo offered it to her, Saruman would not need to be asked twice. And for that, he will always be, as Maglor and Maithros and the Silmarils, unworthy of that which he sought, because the actions necessary to acquire their ends rendered it impossible for them to ever achieve it. So there we have it, Saruman the White, Saruman of many colours, a powerful being whose greed blinded him to the evil of his deeds. What might have been had he acquired the One Ring we will never know, but it is likely that he would have become a thrall of Sauron, just as we see over and over again. The source of what he believed to be ultimate power would in this instance become his ultimate prison. He became a master of ring lore, almost unmatched in his knowledge of a potential powerful and deadly craft. There may have been a Ring of Isengard, but that is referring to the stone wall around the area that holds Orthanc. However, Saruman was still proud enough to call himself Ringmaker. Even he wasn't on the level of Sauron, at least not by the time of the War of the Ring. Who knows how far he could have gone had he never been defeated.
Are you in need of assistance, my lady?
In his heart, Saruman would never admit that he was utterly ruled by his obsessions with power, with the Dark Lord, and with the One Ring. Saruman's corruption was a slow process, and probably began with impatience rather than with evil. Saruman believed humans incapable of acting with wisdom and according to their affairs, a folly of the heart in the mind of the powerful. Like Sauron, Saruman saw disorder and thought he could force proper order on the world as he would have it. As he would not admit in his heart his corruption by Sauron, he would imitate Gandalf in his dark councils, pipe and hat in the very shape of the Grey Pilgrim and yet begrudge him every blessing. Saruman demonstrates the corrupting power of wisdom and how it is often of no benefit to the wise. Now, it is no light thing to say that someone is evil. This is, perhaps, the greatest indictment into someone's character that exists, as it is a rejection of the moral community. An act of evil is one that is, to be as clear as possible here, inhumane to the extreme, whether implicit or explicitly inflicting harm and suffering on others and refusing peace. Was Saruman evil? It is tricky. It is a characteristic of the book largely absent from the film, that is, the ring's actual substance and claim over people in ways almost unremarkable, but deeply influential. Saruman's fascination with the rings of power led him to the forging of his own rings. Saruman the Ringmaker. He is pompous and delusional, and if we think of characteristics that define and demonstrate evil, it is first of all the killing of a person or of persons. Saruman by influence and menace made many ghosts out of men and used the orcs and creatures of his breeding, the fighting Uruk-hai. This is what is at all times fought against. The would-be rulers who created tumult throughout the ages, sought dominion over others, and blood was shed for this. Saruman influenced a world at the tip of a knife blade as it was. Theoden King in Rohan was under his envoy's direct control as one example. Saruman attempted to drive Theoden to despair and impotence while he broke the world beneath his feet, but he overreached himself, and Saruman did just what Gandalf accused him of doing.
Tell me, friend, when did Saruman the Wise abandon reason for madness?
Even when he is defeated, his voice is able to serve him well, and he is able to free himself from the Ents by bewitching a guard. From there he flees to the Shire, where we learn that he has long been in dealings with the more corrupt element of the Green Dragon patrons, who come off as hypocritical and fraudulent, especially if we consider what such folk as Ted Sandyman said about queer folk that Bilbo brought around when he would later happily deal with Sharky. Saruman in his shame is reduced to this pathetic bargaining figure, but only after thoroughly bespoiling the bloom of the rose that was the Shire. A loss that, for Frodo at least, is a permanent one. It is of no use to the war effort. At that point, the war was lost. It seems rather a personal attack on what Gandalf loved more so than any military strategy. Sharky and Lotho Sackville Baggins made great profit here, and the Great Mill is larger and more obscene than ever, belching foul plumes and vapour not unlike the black breath of the Nazgul. In the end, Saruman was more of a Nazgul than Istari and Gandalf. Honestly, proved to be the only wizard who didn't entirely lose the plot. Saruman turned outright evil, responsible for the deaths of thousands. So, how can you say that is not evil? Going back to the question of when Saruman turned evil though, we can look back to that moment of the Gladden Field, when he first glimpsed the possibility of what being a ringmaker could afford him, what powers he could wield, who he could dominate and control. And there is a horrible reveal when Aragorn goes inside Orthanc after the war and finds material remains of his dead ancestor in Saruman's possession. Not only was he able to do such a thing and have such ghastly relics in his possession, at the time he was still dealing on false terms with the White Council too, all in the way to defeat Sauron. What made Saruman evil was not his desire for order, nor his love of the Dark Lore. Everybody needs a hobby after all, that's fine. His obsession proved his end. When Aragorn, with the help of Gimli, finds the Elendilmere, also known as the Star of Elendil, and the chain that likely bore the One Ring, both of which Isildur died with, it just shows Saruman must have found Isildur's body, pillaged it, and most likely burnt it afterwards. Desecration, mishandling the remains of the fallen dead, despite its abject and repeated failure, Saruman continued to search for the ring after them. Therefore Isildur must have fallen not into the deep stream but into shallow water, no more than shoulder high. Why then, though an age had passed, were there no traces of his bones? Had Saruman found them and scorned them, burned them with dishonour in one of his furnaces? If that were so, it was a shameful deed, but not his worst. Within Tolkien's Legendarium, there seems to be an affinity between the desire to attain mastery over the physical materials of Arda and the desire to attain mastery over the wills of other sentient beings. Even when begun in a spirit of sheer creativity and wonder, the craftsmanship impulse turned imperceptibly but surely into the desire to possess and hoard. Back when the Council of the Valar had their plan to send some of their own on a mission to Middle-earth, it all started well enough as Carumo, aka Saruman, volunteered for this, to do his best to stop the forces of darkness gathering in the world. All well and good, until the proud Carumo was forced to accept the lesser-seeming Maya named Iwendil, aka Radagast, and he was thrust upon him. Carumo was obliged to take Iwendil to please Yavanna, wife of Aule, as it says in the Unfinished Tales book. But worse was yet to come. After Manwë convinced the humble Alorin, aka Gandalf, that he should go, it is said. But Alorin declared that he was too weak for such a task, and that he feared Sauron. Then Manwë said that that was all the more reason why he should go, and that he commanded Alorin. Illegible words follow that, seem to contain the word third, but at that Varda looked up and said, "Not as the third," and Carumo remembered it. Galadriel wished to make Gandalf the head of the White Council in Middle-earth when it first convened, this being in the year 2463 of the Third Age of Middle-earth. There were tensions between Galadriel and Saruman for this. Despite her intention to put Gandalf in place as the head of the Order, Saruman was able to use his silver tongue to realize his desire for advancement and to be put above the others, and as Galadriel recalls, "I it was who first summoned the White Council, and if my designs had not gone amiss, it would have been governed by Gandalf the Grey, and then mayhap things would have gone otherwise." Nevertheless, Saruman would have long remembered this attempted snub, and it must have poisoned his thoughts. After all, despite his thirst for ring lore, there is no record of him ever journeying to visit Galadriel, whose woodland realm of Lothlorien lay so close at hand, and there must have been so much knowledge there. But no, he never went. In a game played to the death, geopolitics and the relative might of allies and enemies plays a huge role in one's own strategy, and Saruman, like the rest of the Istari, was clad in bodies as of men, real and not feigned, but subject to the fears and pains and wariness of earth, able to hunger and thirst and be slain. Saruman possessed a prodigious memory, and had travelled from the Grey Havens to the unguessable east with the Blue Wizards, Alatar and Palando, before returning to dwell in Gondor for many centuries before finally settling into his abode at Isengard. Shortly after his arrival on the shores of Middle-earth, Saruman had witnessed the might and glory of the Gondorian king Hiarmendakil I, who decisively defeated the Haradrim, and under whose long 134-year reign, Gondor reached the summit of its power. From that point on, Saruman observed the gradual but irreversible decline in Gondor's power relative to Mordor, which by the time of the War of the Ring seemed impossibly tilted against Gondor and the West. Saruman's realization spurred him in both a sense of dread and a disdain for his allies who seemed incapable of ever prevailing against the rising power in the East. These emotions must surely have weakened Saruman's moral fibre to the extent that previously abhorred thoughts came to be seen as possible, perhaps even necessary if he must almost single-handedly work to defeat the Dark Lord. Foremost of the free peoples of Middle-earth, Saruman took it upon himself to delve deeply into the mysteries at the heart of the Great Rings of Power. In doing so, he exposed himself, much like Marie Curie and the other pioneers of the Radiation Age, to the subtle but very real perils inherent in their subjects, as Gandalf recounted to Frodo in Bag End. "His knowledge is deep, but his pride has grown with it, and he takes ill any meddling. The lore of the Elven Rings, great and small, is his province. He has long studied it, seeking the lost secrets of their making." And also with this, how at the Council of Elrond, Gandalf says too how Saruman has long studied the arts of the enemy himself. Isolation within Orthanc is where all his pride and pursuit of power took the once proud Carumo, the more prideful Saruman. While Gandalf continued to aid and assist the free peoples of Middle-earth by way of constant travel, seeking out knowledge and interactions with the peoples of Middle-earth, with an open mind and will to do what was right. In contrast, Saruman locked himself away inside a dim, foreboding tower that was essentially a pretender's version of Barad-dûr, and Saruman had not even raised his own fortifications. This had the further problem of limiting his interactions with the people that he was meant to protect, and so they became a far-off, distant concept, not living and breathing people whose lives were unique and valuable, down to the very last individual. But to go back to where we began, let's look at Appendix A of The Lord of the Rings to tell us in this timeline just when It all truly started with Saruman. Circa 3000. The shadow of Mordor lengthens. Saruman dares to use the Palantir of Orthanc, but becomes ensnared by Sauron, who has the Ethel Stone. He became a traitor to the Council. So there we have it. While it seems Saruman's double-dealing and corruption appear to have begun much earlier than is widely known, the characteristics for his later evils and attempted evils, not least of all the use of his great knowledge to bring explosives into the Hornburg, to open up the Horndyke and allow his soldiers to enter into the fortress to better facilitate the slaughter of the free peoples of Middle-earth who stood against him and his master. Sauron was not fooled by Saruman's double dealings, rather Saruman was so deceived he was willing to deceive himself. He was corrupted long before he imprisoned Gandalf, before he bred the Uruk-hai within the circles of Isengard, and his pretenses to glory and power should have been seen before he was sent to the world of Arda. But thankfully, the people of Middle-earth, under sound leadership and comprised of honest, decent people, were able to overcome and triumph over these dark forces that we have not lost in our own time, and as long as monsters have been part of our myths and fiction, it is likely they have for just as long been part of our world. And all we can do is fight against them at our best.
When did Saruman the Wise abandon reason for madness?
Saruman is one of the most interesting villains in The Lord of the Rings because he does not begin as a servant of Sauron. He is sent to Middle-earth to oppose him. He is one of the Istari, the White Wizard, the chief of the Order, the head of the White Council. At least that is what he's meant to be. By the time we meet him properly, Saruman has become almost everything his mission was supposed to resist. He builds armies, he tears apart the land around Isengard, he breeds orcs for war, he imprisons Gandalf, he attacks Rohan, he searches for the One Ring, and even after Sauron falls, Saruman's last work in Middle-earth is spite. So the question is not simply, why did Saruman turn evil? No, that's not the one for today. The more interesting question is whether Saruman ever accepted what he had done, what he had become even. Did he even know he had fallen? Or did he convince himself that he was the only one wise enough, realistic enough, or even strong enough to save Middle-earth from Sauron? Saruman's fall is not a single moment where he suddenly chooses darkness. It is the story of wisdom slowly curdling into pride. And by the end, he is no longer serving the Valar. He is no longer truly opposing Sauron. He is serving himself. Saruman was not born as an old man in Middle-earth, we know this story. Like Gandalf, Radagast and the Blue Wizards, he was one of the Istari, one of the Maiar sent from the west in the form of old men. Their task was specific. They were sent to help the free peoples resist Sauron. Their role was guidance, counsel, and encouragement. They were there to awaken courage in others, not to rule Middle-earth in their place. That gives us the clearest measure of Saruman's failure. He does not fall because he lacks knowledge, he falls because he loses sight of what that knowledge is for. Saruman is brilliant. He understands ring lore more deeply than almost anyone. He has authority, reputation, and great power. But the mission of the Istari was never about proving which wizard was the greatest. It was about helping others resist Sauron without becoming another Sauron. Saruman looks at Middle-earth and decides that guidance is too slow. Gondor is weak, Rohan is vulnerable, the elves are fading, the free peoples are divided, and Sauron is rising again. So, Saruman begins to trust his own judgment above the mission he was given. He starts to believe the world needs someone stronger, someone wiser, someone willing to make hard choices. In his mind, that person is obvious. It is him. That is where his fall begins, not with open worship of Sauron, but with the belief that his own wisdom gives him the right to bend the world into shape. Saruman's pride is visible long before his treachery is revealed. He is not some overlooked figure reaching beyond his place. He already has status. He is the White Wizard, he is the chief among the Istari, he is the first of the Order to arrive in Middle-earth, and he becomes the head of the White Council. By outward signs, Saruman is exactly the sort of figure people should trust. That position becomes dangerous because Saruman does not only want to be wise, he wants to be recognized as the wisest. Gandalf becomes the wound he cannot ignore. Gandalf is less grand. He wanders, he smokes, he befriends hobbits. He seems to many far less impressive. Yet again and again, Gandalf receives the trust Saruman thinks should belong to him. Galadriel wanted Gandalf to lead the White Council. Círdan entrusted Gandalf with Narya, one of the 3 Elven rings. And across Middle-earth, Gandalf inspires a loyalty Saruman never truly understands. But he does notice, and that brings resentment. That resentment feeds the part of him that already wants mastery. Gandalf becomes not just a fellow servant in the same mission, but a rival. From there, Saruman's choices become easier to justify. His study of ring lore can be presented as preparation. His secrecy can be called caution. His desire to find the ring can be framed as strategy. He can tell himself that others are too slow, too sentimental, or too weak to face the world as it really is. Underneath all of that, his motives are changing. Knowledge becomes influence. Influence becomes command. Command becomes hunger for the ring itself. Saruman does not begin by admiring evil for its own sake. He begins by believing he understands evil better than everyone else. He studies Sauron, then he imitates him, and eventually the thing he was sent to oppose becomes the model for his own power. Saruman's clearest self-justification comes when Gandalf is brought to Orthanc. This conversation is revealing because Saruman does not speak like a servant crawling to Sauron. He speaks like the only person in the room who thinks he understands reality. The world, it's old and it's passing. The elves, they are fading. The kingdoms of men are too weak. Sauron is growing every day, and the old alliances will not be enough to change that. Saruman's answer is power, knowledge, rule, order. He presents this as wisdom. He speaks as though the moral problem can be managed later, once the practical problem has been solved. If Sauron is too strong to defeat by old methods, then the wise must adapt. They must use power themselves. They must guide the future from above. This is where his self-deception becomes clearest. Saruman can still talk about purpose. He can still talk about shaping events and achieving great things. But the heart of his mission is gone. The Istari was sent to encourage resistance to Sauron. Saruman has convinced himself that domination is simply a more effective form of guidance. Once he accepts that idea, almost anything can be excused. Spying becomes vigilance, deceit becomes strategy, war against Rohan becomes necessity, the destruction of Fangorn becomes industry. Imprisoning Gandalf becomes a reasonable act against someone too stubborn to understand. Even the ring itself becomes in his mind, something he must use wisely. He does not imagine himself as a fool being tempted. He imagines himself as the one person clever enough to use the enemy's weapon without becoming the enemy. Gandalf sees through it immediately, though. The ring cannot be used safely for noble ends. Its power is domination, and anyone who tries to wield it will be shaped by that power. Saruman thinks he can master Sauron's logic. By this point, he has already accepted it. So did Saruman think he was faithfully serving the Valar? By the time he imprisons Gandalf? No, not in any honest sense. But did he still think he was wiser than everyone else? Almost certainly. Did he think the others were naive? Yes. Did he believe his methods were justified by the scale of the threat? That is exactly how he speaks. Saruman's tragedy is that he does not need to believe he is evil. He only needs to believe he is necessary. By the time Gandalf escapes Orthanc, Saruman's fall is no longer theoretical. Isengard has changed. The trees have been cut down, the earth has been scarred, the forge is burned beneath the tower, and orcs and men are armed for war. The home of a councillor has become a fortress. Everything about Isengard begins to look like a smaller, colder imitation of Mordor. Saruman is no longer simply betraying the free peoples. He is trying to become a rival power. He wants the ring, he uses the Palantir, he breeds armies, he attacks Rohan, he turns knowledge into machinery and counsel into command. The peoples of Middle-earth are no longer people he was sent to help. They become pieces in his design. Rohan is just an obstacle. Fangorn is just fuel. Gandalf is just a rival. The Shire eventually becomes a target for revenge. Whatever Saruman may still tell himself, his actions have moved far beyond his original mission. He's willing to destroy good things in order to prove that his way is right. That is what makes him so dangerous. He still has the voice of wisdom. He can still sound patient, reasonable, and persuasive. But the pattern beneath the words is control, the bending of other wills, the treatment of living things as tools. Tolkien is very clear about this kind of evil. You cannot save people by enslaving them. You cannot defend the world by becoming another tyrant. You cannot defeat Sauron by accepting the same hunger for domination that made Sauron what he is. Saruman crosses that line, and he never truly turns back. Even after Isengard is destroyed, Gandalf gives him a chance to leave Orthanc and turn away from ruin. Saruman refuses. He is exposed, diminished, and trapped, but his pride survives. He would rather remain bitter and fallen than accept mercy from Gandalf. Repentance would mean admitting that Gandalf was right, and for Saruman, that may be the one humiliation that he cannot endure. So, by the end of The Lord of the Rings, Saruman has lost almost everything. His army is gone, Isengard is ruined, his staff is broken, his authority has been stripped away, even his voice, once his greatest weapon, has lost so much of its power. But one thing does remain: his pride. And that is why the Scouring of the Shire is so important for his ending as well, not just the hobbits. Saruman is no longer a great military threat. He is not standing in Orthanc as the White Wizard or the Wizard of Many Colours. He is now reduced, bitter and petty. Yet, he still wants power over something, so he turns his spite towards the Shire. The Shire was not a fortress threatening Isengard, it was not the centre of the war, it was the home of the hobbits, the people Saruman had underestimated from the very beginning. By attacking it, he reveals what is left of him after his great plans collapse. He does not become humble, he does not recognise the worth of the small, the ordinary things that he once dismissed. He does not see that hobbits helped save the world while he, one of the wisest on the planet, helped nearly ruin it. He tries to wound their home, and when Frodo offers him mercy, Saruman rejects this once again. That is probably the clearest, final answer to the question. If Saruman still believed he was right, it is not because he was serving the Valar in any meaningful way. That mission had long been since abandoned. But he may still have believed he was wronged. Wronged by Gandalf, wronged by fate, wronged by those who refused to follow his wisdom, wronged by a world that failed to recognise him as the one who should have been in command. That kind of self-deception can survive even defeat. Saruman does not need to believe he is good anymore. He only needs to believe that everyone else is beneath him. Tolkien gives him one final, chilling image. After Wormtongue kills him, Saruman's spirit rises from his body and looks towards the west. He is about to go home, and some readers take this as a final attempt to return to the powers he once served. However, it is a cold wind that comes from the west, and his spirit is turned away. It is one of the bleakest endings in The Lord of the Rings. Saruman began as one of the wise. He was sent with a sacred purpose. He had knowledge, authority, and the chance to help save Middle-earth. But he became so obsessed with being the one in control that he lost the wisdom he was given. So did Saruman think he was the hero? For a long time, probably yes. He told himself he was being practical, that he understood the danger better than anyone else, that terrible means could lead to a better end. Tolkien's answer to that thinking is harsh. Evil methods do not become good because the person using them claims to have a noble purpose. Saruman wanted to defeat Sauron, master Sauron, or replace Sauron. The more he used the enemy's logic, the more he became a smaller reflection of the enemy himself. That is the tragedy of Saruman. He was given wisdom and turned it into pride. He was given authority and turned it into domination. He was sent to help others resist the darkness and ended up spreading a smaller darkness of his own. And when he finally falls, the saddest part is that he still cannot see himself clearly. Only the great mind that should have ruled, still blaming the world for refusing to obey.